Little bit of gold shine in the murky water, glistening diamonds on random street corners. Treasure chest of hope waiting to be discovered. Uncover, undercover, below the radar. Big brother, when we start picking on each other, tell the world that we love her. Tell the world, tell the world. Let them know, let them know.
Find the key like DMT to Terrence McKenna, searching for them sacred blue apples on life's adventures. Unlock our blocks way we really truly meant to. Propel our present and carry on, still remember. History stolen by mad rulers with cruel agendas, pretending they superior, fearing it we surrender. Either let them get us penned up or pen up. We ink filling pages on stages with lasers like lyric Tesla, breaking ground with the sound of an earth tremor. Enter the calm before the storm, we in the center. Universal dispersal of data in a sense of flux. In amongst some ups and downs, seems you got stuck, so we here to unstuck ya. Till you be yelling, yeah, this higher than upper echelons in their deck chairs. Uppercut with a subsonic ruckus to chase them up the stairs. Reclaiming our resources and sharing them till them get there. Only diamond with mine and no finding is the one within. May it never dim to me, it's so magnificent. You may try to deny it, though trust me, it's evident. When I light up shining brighter than any halogen. Only diamond with mine and no finding is the one within. May it never burn out, no, may it never get dim. When I'm in the mic like a diamond gem, like mad money making. But when I'm breaking bread with friends and all the money in demand.
In the darkest place, I find the sweetest things in the roughest face. A smile can bring warmth to the heart, light to the dark, an angelic spark. It'll leave its mark. War and stark, angry dogs bark. Dogs smell fear, but there ain't none here. Tell the world, tell the world. Tell the world that we love her.
Start moving, improving, let's all in. When do we truly realize we are messengers with purpose, one song path, each one of us doing our. When do we truly know who we are? And only then can we start moving, improving, let's all in. When do we truly realize we are messengers with purpose, one song path, each one of us doing our part.
There is no limit to the caring we should have for all living and all life and each other. There should never be any limit.
Tell the world that we love her. Tell the world, tell the world. Tell the world, tell the world. Tell the world, tell the world. Tell the world, tell the world.
Oh, hello. That was, I've forgotten who that was now. Anybody remember? Emma? Tim?
That's Izzy Brown and Elf Transporter, aka Combat Wombat.
Thank you very much, Declan. Nice work. Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the show. I'm Natalie Moxham, and this is a Castlemaine Commons YouTube show that's brought to you by the Castlemaine Collective, a small group of local Castlemaine people that have formed in response to the rapidly changing situation that is COVID-19 pandemic. This is our 10th show. We've run 10 shows, one a week. And we aimed in these shows to foster connections in the community, make sense of what is happening, catalyse action and create our own local future. So welcome to our final show of this series. We would like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Jara people of the Dja Dja Nation, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and their incredible contribution to our story of this place from the past and into the future. The show tonight, like I said, is the 10th show of a series of shows. Across these shows, we've covered many, many different topics. And this show really is that moment in time where we're coalescing all those ideas and actions together. So it's really quite exciting tonight. We have a cast of thousands. A number of the people on tonight's show are most of the collective members. Are coming out from behind the scenes and are going to be on the show. We've re-invited a number of the guests that have appeared across the shows, and we've got quite a few audience members that have been actively participating. And it's been quite incredible going out and about in town and talking to different people about their responses to the shows. So I just wanted to remind us again with a quote from Naomi Klein. Moments of shock are volatile. We either lose ground, get fleeced by elites and pay the price for decades, or we win progressive victories that seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. This is no time to lose our nerve. So thanks everybody for being here tonight. First thing I thought we would talk about is really talk about why we called the show Castlemaine Commons and explore the concept of what the Commons is slightly. So Emma, would you like to share with us what you think the Commons is and why it's important in this moment in time and why it's important for this group of people?
Sure. That's
maybe
really
sorry
big.
if everybody can just introduce themselves, because there is a cast of thousands. Thanks, Emma.
Sure. So I'm Emma King. I live out at Friars Forest. I've been a collective member of the Castlemaine Commons since it was pulled together. And I love, the thing that I love about the concept of the commons and commoning is I feel like it's a really beautiful way to dive right into some really deep value and cultural social shifts that we need to do. You know, we're living in this world of sort of neoliberal capitalist economies where we're all deeply conditioned into the language and the relationships and the systems that uphold those those values. And I think commoning, it really helps me anyway to look at all the things that we need in our lives in a different way. So well, I mean, a lot of the sort of the easy way into looking at the commons is to look at the physical resources, but I think it's also about the social processes that we need to have in place, the ways of governance, the ways of the ideas of direct democracy, of relocalising our economies, and looking at different ways of sharing both our knowledge and our resources and deepening our relationships. And I think it's also, for me, very connected to place and the people that are in this with. So I don't know if that might prompt some other people to make comments. Natalie, do you want to think that some other people would like to?
Yeah. Anitra, would you like to add to that?
Yes, my name is Anitra Nelson and I live in Castlemaine. And I think Emma has given a really broad kind of coverage of commons. It's about caring for people, caring for planet. It's about community and sharing land, skills, facilities, resources, and us delegating use rights to resources as well as responsibilities, and us being really stewards of the planet.
Thank you, Anitra. Ilka, would you like to add to that as well? Or turn your speaker on? Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Ilka White.
Hi, I'm Ilka. I'm living in Castlemaine only a few years, but grew up in this region. And I'm really grateful, Anitra, to your stewardship of the planet part, including that in your definition of commons, because I think we think of the commons as a place, or often it's referred to as a place, and I think the place itself needs to be included in that community. If commons is about of or relate, the definition of or relating to the community as a whole, then the whole needs to include the place. And so the elements of place, including atmosphere, the commonwealth of breath comes to mind, that the word resources is problematic, but the community of place, non-human included, is an important aspect, I think, to any collective. We're all part of it.
Thank you, Ilka. And so we called ourselves Castlemaine Commons to really reflect on and foster that concept of what is the commons. And for me, I think it's been a journey of really understanding what localisation is, and then coming across or rediscovering the concept of the commons. And for me, I think it's a deepening of what localisation is striving to do. So thanks everybody for that. At the end of the show, we're going to then have at the very end, we're going to briefly ask people, well, what do you think Castlemaine Commons should do next? But this conversation is going to weave us through to that point. What I'd like us to do now is really reflect on the 10 shows that we've had. It's been an incredible process. I think each show has emerged, it's come forward and told us that we need to do that. And what's been incredible is tapping into the amazing knowledge resources that we have in this town. And that almost with every show, it was really, really easy to find guests and people that are very knowledgeable on those topics. Nieve, you were invited to the first show. And there's been a number of different climate activists involved in various shows. And I think you've watched most of the shows. So what are your reflections, or what has sparked your interest being a participant and an observer across all of the shows?
So across the whole series, I think they've really brought to light everything that's happening during this pandemic and all the changes that need to be made and how to make them, and particularly shows around climate change, as that's my area, but also economics and how that fits in with climate change and First Nations justice, and how it all ties together in the way we need to make change and move forward after this pandemic.
Thanks, Nieve. I just wanted to really specifically ask the collective members if they had any reflections or comments across all of the shows. Alex?
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you just made about how things weave together. I think one of the challenges of when you try and pick a topic for a show is that in a way you have to refine around a particular set of ideas, and it kind of almost can reinforce the idea that there are silos between things. But we've referred back to conversations, and I think we've started to see how things are interconnected and interdependent, and I think that has to be an ongoing part of the work. So I think it's really important to point that out. But it is a challenge of the format, I think, and it certainly makes me feel like we need to be having far more conversations, far deeper and longer conversations when we are able as well.
Kath?
I suppose for me, it comes down to that really when it's all said and done, and it's shown it through this time, is that where people talk about collective, and I understand that, or even commons, but for me it's family, and you have to, and in all that entails, and the relationship that you have with your fellow person, your brother and sister, in whatever shape or form that looks like, and the connectedness that we all have in that way. And if we see each other in that space, it all of a sudden really changes how we work, live and be with each other, and how we become responsible for everybody, as you do within the family. So I just, that was what I felt to say, and that showed that through the shows.
It's my son. Thanks, Kath. Any other collective members want to make a statement about everything?
Yeah, I think my name's Declan. I don't think my name's Declan. I know my name's Declan. And I've been living on Jara country for about 6 months. I live out in Chewton, and I've been part of the collective. And yeah, this idea of the commons, I think for me, what has been emerging in the whole last few months, globally and nationally and locally, and what I think that the collectives, these live streams have done is like track that well and follow the different things well. But something in particular that came out, and it just came out when Kath was talking about the commons as being family and community being about family. What I think we've seen little touches of is not just the common things that we need to nourish ourselves, whether it's, food or shelter or resources or access, but also the common griefs and the common traumas. And that's when you start to understand that we are family, and that the grief and the trauma doesn't go anywhere. It just gets kind of, it gets pushed away, or it gets reformatted, or, like in a family, like trauma and family and grief and family doesn't go away. It is common to everyone. And something that I think about, particularly with regard to the global grief that we've seen pouring out of America, and the subsequent kind of global focus on that, and the subsequent action and reaction and responses we've had in Australia, is that we have a lot of collective work to do on family trauma and our relationship, our familiar relationship with one another, and our familiar relationship with country, and our familiar relationship with everyone else in our society. And yeah, that sense of like, we're accountable for everyone is accountable, and will suffer from the common traumas and griefs until they are worked out and healed through common means.
Keppel, do you have a reflection on that statement, given that you're a mental health worker?
Yeah, look, thanks, Natalie. I'm Keppel Cassidy. I'm been here in Castlemaine for about 5 years, also living on Jara country. Very happy to be here. I work in mental health and have been in that area for a while now. And yeah, I think there are some big collective traumas that we need to heal and we need to work through. And I agree that healing is not, the Western model typically emphasises individual, and so therapy and healing work is very much individualised. And I think there's a place for that, but I do also think that healing is a collective thing. And I think that what I see in my work is that a lot of the systems in our society at the moment, a lot of the structures are actually meant very unhealthy for people. And so a lot of the people I work with, we're actually trying to help them to heal and to recover from the stuff that's going on around them. It's not because of their own failings or weaknesses. It's because whether it be unemployment, whether it be housing, instability, and so forth. So yeah, it's a very important issue, and there's a lot of healing to be done.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Keppel. We had a show on justice, and maybe I just want to cut to you, Emma and Matthew, around how that show was received and what our thoughts were around that show. And then I'm just going to cut to Lucy Mays for a quick comment.
Yeah, so I mean, I was just sort of noting down from that lovely conversation there about the justice issues. And I think I was really keen to bring justice into as one of the shows, because I think we're often in the work that we do around environment, around economy, that there's a whole depth of conversation and diversity and complexity around bringing everybody along. And I think it was Alex that said in one of the shows, we have to do everything at once. And I think if we, you know, and we've already touched on the issue of siloing and things, but for me, it's making sure that the divisions that the system that we live within now, that are built, you know, the system of division along race lines, gender, class, ability, you know, they're all actually been constructed to prop up the system that we're all trying to change. And so if we don't actually have those issues as core to the broader or to all the work that we do in all the different ways that we're doing it, then we're actually going to be bringing those divisions and those structures along with us into this future that we're trying to create. And I've got to, I mean, it was tricky finding people with lived experience who are willing to speak in public, because often they're the people who are, you know, living with trauma, who are living in poverty, who are perhaps, you know, living in situations of violence and abuse, who are refugees and migrants who are scared for, you know, the implications if they speak out publicly. So, you know, we did have a good conversation in that show, but I think that bringing it, yeah, as I said, bringing those issues to the centre of the work that we do, and making sure that they're not left out of that is really important for me. Matt, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I for me, a lot of it, and we were talking about this from the beginning, a lot of it was not just what issues we discuss, but whose voices we hear. And I think we have a lot of, you know, quite amazing people who've been involved in the show and are involved in our circles, but particularly around that show, it's like, okay, you were commenting on this as we were organizing at one stage, Emma, being aware of, hey, there are all these people that we need to hear from who are not in our immediate circles. And that's something that we need to think about. So not just, I mean, the points that you made about, you know, some people's reluctance for quite real reasons to speak publicly was one issue, but another issue is our networks aren't as extensive in some of those areas. So, you know, the kind of ongoing conversations that we needed was also something that was very much behind the scenes in developing that show. And I think that is still very real. And from there, it's kind of like, in terms of the interconnectedness of, you know, all the different issues that are in the show, I think that came through very strongly, and several people have mentioned it. But in terms of going forward, it's kind of like, okay, well, what frame or what kind of, you know, overarching perspective do we need for what we do going forward that makes sure that those kinds of voices become more included over time? That was some of the reflections I think we had.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Lucy Mays.
Thanks, Natalie. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy Mays. I've lived in Castlemaine for almost 18 years, and I've been part of conversations about how to activate this community towards climate change and social justice for all of that time. And have a great resonance and passion for much of what you've all been sharing. I just wanted to jump in there to respond to a comment in the comments from Trace Bella, who says, I'm concerned for those slipping through the cracks who aren't so connected to family and how to join the dots. And it's exactly what Emma and Matt have just spoken to as well. I think for me, the risk of these conversations is that there's both a benefit and a risk with the tribal nature of our gatherings. You know, we can harness the human instinct towards tribalism for this movement, but we're also at risk of excluding others because of our tribe, and we might not even be, or certainly there's a level of insight and awareness into the extent to which we are a tribe with shared values and shared language. But you know, I just always think it's such a sensitive one that we tackle, and often I find people who are drawn to these sorts of movements and conversations might be community development practitioners or healers or people in service to others. And that puts us in a position to have a very strong sensitivity to this risk, but equally it puts us in a position of power over, which again, we can be aware of on one conscious level, but I think there's an unconsciousness as well to a degree, and it comes back to that joining the dots that Trace has talked about, and that we're all grappling with this, who's missing from these conversations, where do we find them, how do we include them? For me, the commons means what do we have in common, and how do we find those touch points with people in our communities and invite them into these conversations with, you know, a renewed understanding when we use the words access and inclusion. We've used those words traditionally to include people who are obviously marginalised or perhaps overtly marginalised. But I think there are many people in this conversation who are marginalised at all different levels of the power spectrum. And I've heard that through a number of the different conversations around bridging. You know, how do we bridge these conversations and make our language accessible for people who are isolated, vulnerable, struggling alone, who would not feel comfortable stepping into this tribe, who would not resonate with the language and the identification of this tribe, but equally those who have power in our communities and in our society, who equally would not identify. But if we can reach to find what we have in common and express that and articulate that, and perhaps to a degree, let down our own guard around our certainty of position and our certainty of values, and allow for the possibility that there's a lot that we don't know and can learn from perhaps not the obvious suspects.
Okay,
I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Lucy. What has really impressed me has been the response by a number of different organisations in the community that came together very, very quickly. Our first couple of shows really talked about that response, and it's exciting to have Emma Shannon on the show tonight. So Emma, really, would you like to just make a few comments around that? But I also then wanted to flip us over into the positive side of what's happened, specifically around the neighbourhood, the rise of the neighbourhood resilience groups and the conversations that we've been having in that kind of welfare response to the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was fantastic to see the response. And I think what was amazing is a lot of the response was driven by community this time. And I think what I saw happen differently was service providers and organisations turning towards community and listening to community much more than they ever have, because we did have the power, and we had the ability to move quickly and come together really quickly, whereas some organisations weren't able to do that quite as well as we were. So we saw the community pantry come together. I think there was over 13 different organisations involved in the pantry, which is amazing, and that's still going at this point. We had a whole heap of conversations about, and exactly what you're talking about, how do we communicate and get information out to the people who aren't connected in the way that we are. It was fantastic to have representatives from MASDAG, the Mount Alexander Shire Disability Advocacy Group, on most of the groups that I was a part of. So it was wonderful to have that voice there. And Kath, Koff, and Eldaron were involved in all of the conversations as well that I was. So just in my experience, so we've tried to reach lots of different parts of the community. But I think, yeah, when we go on to talk about resilience, I guess what I just said then points to there are different levels of resilience, and organisational resilience is different to community resilience. And I guess that's one of the things that we'll have a look at when we evaluate our response, both as a community and on behalf of the community organisations that I'm representing. So how prepared were we? How quickly could we move? What's happening there?
What's happening, Kath?
So sorry, my children are trying to watch.
I just saw floating hair then. So yeah, and who fills the gaps, and how to maintain relationships as we move forward, so that, you know, these relationships that we've built with all parts of community actually continue and continue to build, and we are more prepared next time. And I guess that's the conversation we've been having in the facilitator community wellbeing group that was pulled together at the start of this pandemic. And so we are looking towards, those things exactly. How do we strengthen relationships and inclusion, continue to support mental health and wellbeing, which includes advocating for the services and the gaps that are there right now. How do we build a response system for next time? And we're looking closely at these conversations, and we're going to do some evaluation of the response and look at what comes from the evaluation to help us move forwards with that.
One thing, I'm going to come back to you and Kath and Declan. One thing that we did a number of shows looked at in different ways was we had a show on the First Nations response to the pandemic. We've also dipped in and out of the Black Lives Matter conversations and response. So for you, Kath, Declan, how's that been for you just in terms of First Nation voices?
Do you want me to be honest, Nat?
Sure.
Of course. I found it really hard. I found the event was amazing. To hold a space like that, to try and shift and bring about change on such a large scale about a topic that we've been having to deal with for ever since I was born, and 230 years. Having people's coming, I've just found it really, really big. I've found it really, really hard. It's been really draining, and I've been really struggling. And it's not a new fight for us. This is a fight we've been doing for a long time, and we'll continue to do. We just really hope for action, and we're hoping to see it. And, you know, we talk about change. I just think it would be far better if one of us was running the business, really, because that's what makes it really hard if people don't seem to understand how we work as people, and how we work with each other and everyone else. So I just we love the learning that has happened. We love the swell of love. We just working out the best way forward in that space.
Dec, anything?
So I pretty much, like, within the first week of arriving and living in the area, got connected with Uncle Rick and Julie and Kath, and you know, was introduced in a what felt like a really good way by Camilla, just to the local people who were, you know, as an Aboriginal person, I was going to be working with and going to be accountable to. And I felt really immediately from when I began living here in October that this was a place where I could live and where my contributions were welcome. And so this, you know, my settling into, you know, relationships with all the Koori people here has taken place at this really tumultuous time. And so it's meant that, like, my relationships have become, like, quite deep quite quickly. And even before I had, you know, friendships through music or friendships through other things that I was passionate about, like, I'm now in a place where I'm, like, very, like, deeply committed to and connected to Naldaran and you know, local Koori voices and the Koori mob. And I feel really like it's galvanized my commitment to cultural projects and my commitment to the way that the Aboriginal cause in this place is unfolding. And so I feel really, like, grateful to have been invited in to be a contributor to local matters. And that was really evident when a really strong part of that was in the first few weeks of the pandemic, when there was a call to action for the Naldaran food bank. And that was my first basically initiation into Naldaran as an organisation and meeting different Naldaran allies. And it felt really like being a part of something that felt really urgent, really immediate. And also there was a sense of, like, militancy and a sense of, like, this direct response, and like we felt as though at that point we thought that we were going into, like, it felt like war, you know. In the early days of the pandemic, it felt like war, and I felt like I was preparing for war. Like I prepared my home basically as a bunker that I could organize out of. I started getting really fit, and I just was like, well, I need to treat this as though war is happening. And being at some of those early Nalderun meetings was like, we might be preparing for a very long winter where people are going to be very hungry and have very little food and very little money. So it was really galvanizing for me. And the other thing I would just say a little bit to add on to what Kath's been saying, I've been exhausted as well in the last couple of weeks, and something's become really, really apparent to me on my own journey of decolonization of myself and my understanding of the world, is that we're at a point now where Aboriginal people we can't teach anymore about Aboriginal culture and about the Black movement until the rest of society engages in a self-directed process of anti-racist learning and understanding the way that white power and imperialism has imposed itself on the world and upon all the structures and the ways that we live. Because for us to continue to educate about Aboriginal matters and Aboriginal history with people who haven't done their own work within themselves and their families and their own non-Aboriginal communities, it's completely exhausting for us. So what we're really asking for and what we're really pushing is that people need to understand white supremacy and how imperialism works and how white power works. And there's got to be like a real process of collective unlearning, so that we can sit safely at a table where people are ready to do that deeper collaborative work with Aboriginal people. Because until then, we're teaching the same lessons again and again and again, and it's completely unfeasible for us. So yeah, all blackfellas around the country are exhausted at the moment, and it's partly because we've got to educate. So yeah, that's a bit of a spiel, but that's my thoughts on both those matters.
Thanks, Declan. The people that helped in organising the Black Lives Matter gathering the other week, we got together and we looked at the 134 declarations to take action. It was quite amazing. We're working through those and we're going to do stuff, which we're still processing. But I understand, Nieve, things might be happening at the high school.
Yes. So I didn't introduce myself before, but I'm Nieve, and I go to Castlemaine Secondary College, and I'm in year 12 and a school captain and part of SRC. And so in light of Black Lives Matter, we wanted to hold a day of fundraising at school, which is going to happen in next week sometime. And on Kath's suggestion, that we use the money to create curriculum change, to teach about Aboriginal culture and history and the ecology of our local country. And so working with Nalderun, we hope to create long-term change and a long-term policy that then hopefully other schools can implement in the future.
That's great, Nieve. And it's great to see the action happening so quickly by the young people. Once again, young people leading us in Castlemaine. I'm going to move on a little bit because there's lots of topics that people still want to talk about. Economics has been, actually, you know what we might do? I might just, because we're still kind of in that question of reflecting on the shows, but I think we might shift that a little bit now to the second question that I really wanted to ask people is what are you noticing that is emerging in the community? So what change do you see bubbling up, asking for action? It's not what action are we going to take, it's what do you see as emerging in the community? Ilka, can I come back to you? Remember you mentioned going off-grid?
Yeah, I guess I was reflecting on what's been bubbling up that I've seen, and I feel like I've felt like I've dropped personally off-grid, and off-grid in terms of off my previous work timetable, and also off the street grid. So I've spent a whole lot more time in this period in the wilder places of town and foraging and dwelling and loving it. And I feel as though the what that's asking of us, that the action that observation and that experience is asking of us, is to focus more on living in an ecosystem, and the ecosystem as a whole, and to live as an inhabitant of place, and that there's a custodial relationship that's expected when you dwell and live in that way.
Thank you, Ilka. Lucy Young, what did you notice? A consciousness shift?
Well, I think I've been reflecting on all the things that people have been saying so far, and it's not so much that I noticed that there has been a consciousness shift, but more that there's a desire to engage in things like, you know, recognising white supremacy, or reevaluating what our relationship is to, or our connection to country or nature or each other, looking at how we make meaning of life, which to me all kind of equates to a consciousness shift around, you know, what are the questions that we need to be asking in order for something different to emerge? That I'm kind of noticing lots of bubbling up of questions. How do we do something differently to what we've been doing? What are the questions that we need to be asking?
Warwick, you've joined us. What's emerging for you?
Hi. A lot of things, I think. I mean, I think there's been a lot more deeper social connection, I feel like, amongst people who have previously been acquaintances. So I think, you know, people are already very close beforehand. Obviously, we're going to stay close throughout this strange time. But I do feel like, particularly very locally, like around our neighbourhood, that there's been more than just the wave and say hi as a result of this period, and a desire to keep that going, and some, you know, all these ad hoc structures that have formed around that are really interesting. We have a local messenger group just for our street that's become very active, and I don't see that changing. And I guess, you know, so many things I guess I could talk about, but you know, perhaps we'll jump to the economics, which is just because that's, you know, that's what my session was about and what my profession is. But you know, there's been lots of talk about how we facilitate this from an economic perspective, and from several different directions. Just recently, a conversation keeps coming up about a local currency. And the capacity that a local currency has to sort of reinvigorate and continue to connect. You know, it's a sort of connection in a different sense. If we're using a currency that can only be used here and that's generated here, and the capacity of that of currency creation to actually sort of mobilize resources. You know, it's something that the government could do, but they're not doing it, and perhaps not likely to do it. So we should think about how we can do it without them. And that includes, you know, if we got it right and we created a currency and we did it well, we could give jobs to all of our unemployed people here. And what a great thing that would be. And you know, well fund our growing and dynamic Indigenous organisations and initiatives. And, you know, there's so much that is sort of held back because of a need for resources. And, you know, if we thought hard about this and we did it right, then we could really do a lot and give, you know, kind of, I suppose, energy and a livelihood to people who are doing these things that we care so much about, always relying on volunteer labour.
Thank you, Warwick. Keppel, do you want to just read that out quickly, what you just said in the chat?
Yeah, sure. So I just quite inspired to hear what Warwick's saying about local currency. That's one of my interests as a as a tool for regenerating local economies. And I think that what I'm seeing, and sort of echoing what Warwick's described there, is people are really looking for a way where the economy can actually support community rather than community having to survive the face of economy. So how can economy support community regeneration and also the regeneration of nature and the earth? And there's lots of great ideas on that, which I'm sure we can talk more about. But I think that's one of the sort of upwellings there that's, and particularly also this idea of thinking about other people in the economic process, not just what's in it for me, but thinking about my local businesses, thinking about my neighbours, people I know, and caring and acting, I'll go and support this business because, they're doing it tough at the moment, not they're the cheapest. Just a change in mindset.
And to just slightly segue the economics conversation across to artists, Alex, make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's heaps to say, but I think one of the interesting things that's happening is that artists have been really maligned and left behind. They've been left out of the JobKeeper stimulus, and there's been kind of radio silence from government about the role of artists. But interestingly, one of the projects that at a very nascent stage around currency locally is being driven by artists. And I think that the thinking around something like a currency, when that is driven from an artistic sensibility rather than necessarily like a linear growth thinking, is one example of the way that coming at something from a very different framework is really necessary. I mean, look, sometimes I speak in forums about the role of arts and the critical role of artists, and I bang on a lot about how potent and powerful and important artists are. But to be really honest, I think right now we just need everyone, everything, every skill, every possible area of expertise and interest and passion that anybody has in anything, because we have to transform everything. So, yes, the artists are important and they will bring us new ways of thinking and imagining that are required, but we need all of the expertise of everybody to then put those imaginings into actual shape in the real world that we can use to go forward.
Sam, would you like to add a comment?
Yeah, I'd love to actually. The Commons, just touching on so many things. The Commons means the street for me, in that respect that it's a public space where, as a street theatre artist most of my life, that's where I've found people have stumbled across art and it's been a life-changing experience and they haven't bought a ticket to come and see it. And that talks to what Lucy Mays was talking about, which is that we're all here having this intellectual debate, and there's a lot of our town and a lot of our society that don't engage in this kind of conversation at all, and action actually speaks much louder than words in that respect of not just preaching to the converted. So I feel like there's a real responsibility to actually not stop talking, but on a walk I had with Declan a few weeks ago, we were like, what's stopping us from getting a drum kit and a bass guitar and hitting the street and just freestyling some hip hop or whatever, just to cut through this stuff. I'd been traveling most of my adult life, and when I settled down in Castlemaine, I had this crash course in what non-for-profit organisations were, what evaluation processes are. All of these structures are represent. I live in a social housing group and now work as part of the organisation of that group. And it was all stuff that I'd avoided very, very consciously since I was a teenager, because in Thatcherite Britain, I didn't want a piece of it. I actually found freedom away from all of these types of conversations. But now, as a father of two beautiful, bright, young kids, talking, listening to what Kathy's saying, and just, like having had this sense of relief in the lockdown to actually to have had the freedom to live like we always actually really want to live. Neither of me or my partner could get to have a 9-to-5 job. We're below the poverty line and always have been, and happy there. We don't value, you know, we don't measure our time with money and all of those kinds of things. So I feel like I want to get this stuff into the body. I feel like we need to, you know, like, it's not all neck up business, even though these conversations are important. I feel like I can help in such a way to get people moving again, dancing again, not acting's not the right word, performing again, expressing themselves in the commons in a way that that feels like it affects our daily lives. Yeah.
That's great, Sam. What an incredible segue to action. And I think for me, art and artists and philosophers and spiritual leaders have been the three sort of sectors that I've really listened to and engaged with through the pandemic to guide my thinking and take me through that moment. And I think this is a really good point at which to turn around and say, we have a state festival. So, Jan, any thoughts on comments on the State Festival and the role of art and what it should play in our community?
Yes. G'day, everybody. My name's Jan, and I'm a storyteller, musician, a writer, and a producer. I've been here since 1997, working here and out of here since then. I'd like to chuck in a question that's pertinent to the moment, but it's a question a town like this should ask, you know, regularly. And that is, what is the point of the Castlemaine State Festival? And by that, I mean, of course, you could answer there's tourism, there's attracting visitors to town, all that stuff. But what is the relationship between us and the Castlemaine State Festival now, given that the festival probably won't be importing the people from overseas like it did in the past, etc. What should our relationship be with the festival? It's the biggest event in town. It takes up 2 weeks. It's a huge shebang. It takes up more arts money than any other thing, and a lot of other things combined. Where do we stand in relation to it? And I've watched the festival over many, many years here and have participated 5 times in the main program. So I'm not here as a complainer. I am a respecter of the festival, but I think it's time to ask, what's the point? What's the purpose of the festival?
Anybody? I'm not going to delve into all the answers and dig down into this too deeply, but anybody?
I'll just roll on a bit. Did anybody notice the new festival in Melbourne that's replacing the Melbourne International Festival and the White Night, called Rising? They called for expressions of interest. They just said, chuck us your idea. Don't go into all of the huge budgetary business to do with it. We just want to hear your passionate idea. I'd love to hear that from the Castlemaine State Festival. I looked all over their website today and I couldn't find anything at all relating to that. There might be thoughts going on behind. I don't know, but it feels like this would be a great opportunity to open the lid on it for local participation.
Lucy Young?
Are you wanting me to speak to what I was writing in the chat?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'll just make a plug for this Rob Hopkins book. If people haven't read this one, most people are familiar with the transition towns, but, you know, his latest work is really about the role of art, nature connection, how we can actually get ourselves into a different mindset to ask different questions and come up with different answers. So, you know, I really would love to, you know, to be attending improvisation workshops, to be, you know, being asked because it's funded for me to go and do art when I haven't done it since whenever. All of these things that can actually shift us out of our heads into our bodies and into a different way of relating. That's what I'm interested in, what Rob Hopkins has written extensively about.
Terry White, you were sharing with me that sense of urgency and perhaps this state fest and this kind of deep psychological shift that we need to have happen for us to enable to enact our transition plan. Thoughts on that? Maybe in relation to the State Festival, climate change, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking that this period that we've had, this weird period of time off from whatever, has for me and for a number of the people I'm working with at the U3A course that I'm running on climate change, given us time to look seriously at the rubbish culture that we've grown up with. We begin every one of our lessons with a Nolan acknowledgement of country. And it seems to me that that entry into 1.5 hours of examination of some of the many aspects of climate change exemplifies exactly what's wrong with us. That we start from this love of country, this love of family, that the bird or the mountain or this valley is family. And then we go and look at the economic system and we find that it values non-humans above humans, that the corporation is basically bulletproof. It can operate here with paying no taxes. And we look at the legal system. There is no crime of ecocide. There's been attempts since 1948 to get the crime of ecocide up before the United Nations that have failed. So you can be Rio Tinto and you can bulldoze the world's wisdom with no charges being laid. The whole worship of stuff, the commodification of everything. I think many of us, we're getting on, but we come away from these sessions really bruised. We have on the one hand a vision of life which is millennia old and which is it stood the test of time, and we've lived within this fairy floss fabrication, which is all somebody's idea of a good thing, and generally the idea of somebody who's after money. And so the work that we have to do, I guess early on, I have great respect for what you've done here. You've opened a conversation up for this town so that we can see one another thinking. And that instinct to get people together in face of a crisis is really solid and sound. What I've missed is, I think, the depth and depravity of the hole that we've buried ourselves in. And I have this sense of urgency that we go now, based on this getting to know you stuff, that we get out to the other end where we're actually grappling with real things, real issues, and we're punching above our weight. And that means not just in our local area, but in our state area and our national area and in our international area. And this tool of Zoom would allow us to reach out beyond the people we know and love here in this town, and to have Naomi Klein on the Zoom discussion, to have the best climate scientists in the world on our Zoom discussion. It's possible, they're up for it. You can do it from their lounge room. So I'd love to see this town shift the world, not just shift Mount Alexander. It's within our grasp. And I'm impatient for that.
Thank you, Trevor. Terry, sorry. I'm thinking I need to go to Trevor quite soon. He's been sitting there, not talking. Thank you, Terry. Camillo, have you got something to add?
Oh, I was just sitting with Terry's beautiful words, actually, and pretty moved by all that. Thank you, Terry, for all that you do in our community. And I feel that bruising that you're talking about, and the idea of going back to business as usual gives me much more fear than any virus. I'll ever come across. I've got to tell you, I remember having a poignant moment during this COVID time of just sitting with the silence that was outside and reflecting that this is possibly the only time in my life that I'll experience this silence, and really hoping that it wasn't. But once now that noise has started again, yeah, it's back. And I do hope for a shift, and there's things happening in many ways, but yeah, I'm certainly sitting with everything that Terry just said.
So in putting this show together, we emailed probably 35 people and we asked them what action is emerging for you. And it was quite incredible, the response. So I'd really like now people to speak to that response, to that action they're now thinking of taking. Does that make sense? So kind of less discussion and almost like a list of things. Because I've just had this list thrown at me throughout today, and it's quite inspirational. Well, I found it quite inspirational. So I might just start this with one of the questions we asked people was what have we not covered in the shows that really should be covered? We limited ourselves to 10 shows. However, we could have gone on and could have done more shows, and maybe that's what we should do after we have a break. So here's a little list of what people suggested has not been covered. And Emma, maybe can I start with you and that comment from Ali Handley that she gave?
Sure. So yeah, this is one that Ali sent through. I'd love to see a discussion on gender. I feel like a lot of women have perhaps reconnected with the home space, started baking, etc. But are we reverting to old gender roles? Is the government prioritising male industries in its recovery packages? And of course, as we know, domestic violence has spiked, and some have suggested that there may be a large influx of women seeking refuge once things have moved out of lockdown, as they have not been able to leave during it. So I think, yeah, that's a really haven't touched on much yet.
Yeah, great. Another one that people have mentioned and that we talked about a lot ourselves, but we never quite got to it, was democracy, deep democracy, participatory democracy. We have our local government elections coming up, and I know and I understand that a number of different people are thinking of running in our local government elections. So that's something we could explore and do. Another one that was mentioned that we talked a little bit around, which I think is a really interesting topic, is intergenerational relations. Something that's really clearly come out in response. We talked about people being isolated, people being more vulnerable, and the flip side of that was the neighbourhood resilience groups and people being connected more deeply with their neighbours. But I've also seen a lot of intergenerational connection going on, grandchildren talking to grandparents, things like that going on. So one of the shows I think we wanted to potentially do is to talk about that in the intergenerational connection, and we could talk about intergenerational debt and that urgency. And you know, if you think about where that urgency is coming from, it's coming from the younger people and it's coming from the older people. So how do we unite across those generations? There's another suggestion. So other people on actions that you can see are emerging or you are going to act on, and or invite others to join you on. Can I cut to Warwick? Oh, you've had your local currency yarn, haven't you? Maybe Anitra and Warwick, do you want to briefly speak to the Central Vic Mutual Aid? Anitra?
Okay, so Central Victorian Mutual Aid is one of its main foci is mapping and detailing productive cultural social resources and alternative sustainability activities and groups. And I was kind of thinking that in terms of our group here, because Central Victoria Mutual Aid covers this whole region and we're just a little part of it in the middle, perhaps localising Leanganuk could be a hub for mapping and detailing Mount Alexander Shire resources, activities and groups. And we've already got some lists of these things, but it's sort of like bringing it all together and it being a live hub that's continuously changing that people can go to. And more than data collection, I think it's kind of a really useful base for community deliberation over what is going to be our future and how we can transform easily. So I suppose it's just really basically expanding and extending local lives, global matters.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Anitra. Anybody else with an action? Put your hand up so I can see you. Trevor. Trevor, maybe just pop your audio microphone on.
Okay.
Good on you, Trev.
What is that? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go for it.
Okay. Look, I'm Trevor from Central Vic Climate Action. I've been a resident of Castlemaine for quite some time. I'm a semi-retired architect. I have an interest in science. I think that what's really important to me, and it's been said by a few people, that instead of bouncing back, we bounce forward. We have all these threats, and climate change is certainly one of the most serious. And the need to act on that has, we are under threat of a global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. And we've seen what that temperature rise can do this summer with these tragic fires. So our government is currently suggesting that we have a gas-led recovery, and we're saying no, that we just cannot afford to do that because again, it's a fossil fuel, and again, it is going to add to greenhouse gas, and again, it's going to add to global temperature. So what we're faced with, if we don't act on this, is an unstable climate, temperatures that human life cannot exist in, and so going forward, we need to insist that our government has a renewable-led recovery. And of course, we need to reduce our individual carbon footprint. We all need to cut down on energy. And I think that one of the things that this pandemic has shown us, that we should not be flying as much as we should. We should be using our cars less. We should be, perhaps, if we're still able to cycle when instead of using our car. There's so many things that we can do to reduce our own footprint. And that is tied in with things like the farmers market, where there's an example of how we can reduce the waste footprint, which has become almost as important. All these things are tied in together. And all of these are being seen in this time of pandemic, when things have stopped, as, oh, hey, look how quiet things are, look how much less pollution there is. And if we don't take note of this, I think that, you know, going forward and going back to business as usual is a disaster, and we can clearly see that. On a local scale, I think that the Black Lives Matter has certainly made me look at how I'm not inclusive of people of different skin colour. I think that we consciously need to make an effort to be inclusive of them. We have done some hazard reduction burns quite recently, and we have brought First Nations people in to have input. But I think we need to do these things more and more. I think we need to make them feel confident that they're part of our community, and it's not just a white community. I think we take it for granted that we're the ones that do all the action, and they don't, or they can't, and I can understand why they feel that way. I think yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Cam, comment? Sorry, Cam Walker, comments on the climate?
Gosh, there's so much to say, isn't there? And I agree with so much that is being said. And I think very early on, it might have been Emma said, well, we need to do everything. And that's true. And I kind of feel like everything is happening. So what I'm hearing lots of people talking about, that sense of reflection, and, you know, it's the same. I go for a walk out on the golf course and there's 3 times as many people as normal and everyone is chatty, and there's just this amazing opportunity to connect with people in a way that is normally really hard. And then politically, you know, so from zooming out, I just think like we live in an amazing moment. I'm waking up every day and just thinking what's going to happen today. And you look, you know, Declan said it, there's a sense of militancy, there's a sense of urgency, but there's a sense of opportunity. And I just feel like we're really on the cusp of something very, very exciting. And we've just had, you know, 4 grinding decades where neoliberalism, where kind of unbridled capitalism has defined almost anything we do at any point in our lives. And I just feel like that is running its course. But it won't be replaced by something better unless we replace it with something better. And so, you know, I feel like we live in a very, very rich moment where not that anything is possible, but everything is up for grabs. And Trevor said it, you know, we've got all these opportunities around recovery. How do we do the recovery? Is it a gas-led recovery? Is it a renewables-led recovery? But the main thing that I really hold on to is this sense of the opportunities are amazing. And if you think about just 6 months ago, we're having these conversations that would have been unthinkable. You know, the concept of a universal basic income for everyone, the concept of rebuilding our social services, rebuilding our public infrastructure, rebuilding the ability of governments to intervene really well for good rather than mediocrity. So yeah, really exciting time. And it's going to evaporate very quickly, and if we're going to seize it, we do need to seize it now.
Thanks, Cam. I'm just trying to make sure everybody gets a chance because I have a huge list of things that people wanted to suggest. Emma, Shannon, there's been conversations in the welfare group about potentially exploring the whole idea of a more intensive resilience project. I know that we've been having conversations around the council's ability to respond, service sector organisations' ability to respond, and then we've seen this rise of these neighbourhood resilience groups. One key pivot point for me was when we tried to get the CFA and the SES to distribute the communication flyers. Would you like to talk about that and what's emerging from that whole resilience side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, it was, like I said before, it was amazing to see that a lot of the community did mobilise and a lot of these resilience, neighbourhood resilience projects rose up and people were acting quite very, very locally. And one of the things we wanted to do was to support that, but it's very tricky. We have, you know, we have a lot of supporting materials, and obviously we spoke to Alex and other people who had created these little projects, but it's kind of has to come from the ground up as well. So it's not something we can impose. And Anitra talked about mapping what's going on, and that would be a fantastic resource that we could then, you know, pinpoint areas that don't have that kind of neighbourhood groundwork going on and see what we can do to work with those areas. So that's one idea. Yeah, I agree. The CFA and SES, it was quite tricky. They've been obviously extremely busy with the bushfires over summer as well. And it was difficult. That didn't come from any local kind of, you know, well, it didn't come from locally. That was a regional directive for them not to be involved in distributing resources. So we had created resource packs for people that perhaps didn't have the internet. We know there was so much information online during this time, but we know some of the most vulnerable people don't have access to the internet. So we wanted to get information out to them. So yeah, look, I think we're open to ideas. I think we want to continue getting together. I think we want to tap into the community resilience that's there and build that so that organisations can pivot and be resilient as well. So yeah.
Okay, cool. I know Julie Miller-Markoff and Luke from Council and a few other people would really like to get together and talk about potentially a resilience project. So really looking at how we do that. So if anybody else wants to put their hand up for that, that would be really great to hear from you. Declan, you've got your hand up, probably because you're the only one that can figure out how to do it.
Oh, I had my hand up when kind of when Cam was talking.
Yeah, cool.
But I wanted to loop back a little bit on that, and I think also Trevor was talking about local, like was it Terry that was talking about local but beyond the local?
Yep.
So yeah, just with reference to that, I think like, I mean, my thinking around change is that we live in an era where only the state has the power to make the kind of change that we need to actually, reduce the disastrous impacts of climate change. And I think that at the community level, the responsibility is to build resilience and capacity. But I think at the state and at the federal level, which I think as citizens, we have a responsibility to be actively involved in that level of change if we are able to be. And I think that we're at a time where we need to recognise that only the state has the power to make those kind of economic changes and do things like divest from coal and invest in renewables. And there's I think we're living in this. I think what we've seen recently is a bit of a breaking open of the myth that that protest doesn't work, or that protest takes time, or that protest is an inefficient way to affect change. And I think that something that landed for me really strongly was seeing what can happen in 2 weeks in America, like the amount of policy change. Like there are significant structural and systemic changes to policing and to the way that people conceive of their democracy and the way that people conceive of their parliaments and power. And in America, and I think that we live in a time where we've got tens of thousands of people out on the street for Black Lives Matter solidarity protests. We've got tens of thousands of people led by students out in the street. We've got action, we've got movement, and I think that we don't have the same simmering history of tension and violence around that particular issue that America has had and that we've seen boil over. But I think this is a time for us to open our eyes and see that serious, sustained, and more militant action on the streets is something that actually can force government's hand. And I think sooner or later we've got to more thoroughly and democratically weaponize the kind of people power that we have out on the streets. And we've got to make we've got to sustain and make clear our demands as we've been doing within the climate movement. But I think we've got to put our money where our mouth is. I think we've got to put our bodies on the line. I think we've got to force a conversation into the streets, and we've got to force government to take action. I think we live in a moment where we've seen that it's actually sometimes a bit easier than people think it is, and it happens a lot quicker than people think it does. And I think we have to force government's hand. I don't really believe that local only action and small scale economies and supporting local businesses, I don't think that's actually going to have the effect that we need on global climate change. I think that's got to be multi-layered. And I really think that we need to seize this opportunity and look at the images that we're seeing where people have forced government's hand and believe that we can actually do that as well.
Thanks, Declan. Nieve?
Yeah, just going on from what Declan was saying and how that change, while it'd be amazing if it could come through local government, like local council, it really does need to come from governments higher up, so state and federal, because currently in the society we hold, they have the power to create the change at the biggest level. And so to make that change, we need to come together like as a collective and fight for climate justice and raise Indigenous voices in the convos around that and in the movements that come out of that. So as we move towards climate justice, and as part of School Strike for Climate, we're going to hold an event which is in the future soon. We don't have quite a date yet, but more to come on that. But we're going to hold an event about protesting the gas-led recovery that the government or the federal government is pushing for their own agenda.
Thank you, Nieve. Can I just, everybody wants to have a say now. And we need to be mindful that we're going for an hour and a half, and I don't think we should go longer than that. We have 10 minutes left, okay, at the maximum. So I'm just going to cut to a couple of people and just say exactly the action you're thinking about, yeah? Without any intro and justifying it, just saying what the action is. Alex.
There was a really strong call from Paul from Mazdag on the Centering Justice episode, where we were talking about the fact that town has over 50% of the buildings in town are inaccessible. And I think that's a no-brainer for us to get behind as a community, because that is just appalling. I think we need to figure out centering disability justice. And I am sorry, but I am going to make this point. We need to get out of our silos. So when we say no gas-led recovery, we say don't give the money to the gas companies, give that money to investing in the NDIS. We say don't give stimulus packages to people, wealthy people, to renovate their houses. If you want to stimulate the construction industry, give that money to creating accessible buildings in communities. So we need to be really always, when we say no to something, we need to say yes to something else, and we need to be much better at centering the justice and the world we want when we say what it is that we're opposing.
Lucy Young, you wanted to say something?
Yep, and in the interest of being succinct, it's just a bit of an end at the end of all of these ideas about what resilience means. Is it's not just from Rob Hopkins, resilience is not just an outer process, it's also an inner one. And any process that misses that we require a growth in our abilities to communicate with each other, to support each other through uncertain times, and to build our own personal resilience misses a huge part of the picture. So my commitment is, that I haven't spoken about, is ongoing training with nonviolent communication.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And Lucy Mays.
I'd just like to offer up 2 existing platforms and networks which could be of use here. I work as the Manager of Engagement for Goldfields Libraries, which covers 17 sites of service delivery across 4 shires. We have an amazing platform where we host events, programs, exhibitions, and we have a mailing list of, 25,000 people. We've made a commitment this week to be leaders in the self-directed process of anti-racist learning, to facilitate people's connection with resources and lifelong learning in that way. We are also running a campaign to capture reflections on what a new normal might look like, called Life in Lockdown. And before we went into lockdown, Nieve, I don't know if you were folded into these conversations, but we were planning a Youth Week activity with our climate activists from this community to give them another platform around the what next conversation. And we plan to continue with that. There are many other opportunities. Feel free to talk to me. The other network is Community Leadership Loddon Murray, which is a group that I have worked for and now consult to. An amazing network of leaders from right across this region as well, who have come often from a place of not being in the tribe or in the tent, and have been taken on a journey of learning and being opened to new ways of thinking and believing. They're change agents. They're ready to go. Give them a job, and I reckon they'll be jumping on board.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Terry? Turn your audio on.
I'd love to see this group and this process formulate a manifesto, a Mount Alexander manifesto, which names the corruption, which offers a life-affirming rather than a life-denying form of governance. I think there are so many things that are taken for granted. I can dump, in past times, I could dump a semi-trailer load of abattoir offal in the Yarra with impunity. That era is now past, but I can still dump a semi-trailer into the atmosphere with impunity and be rewarded by a fossil fuel subsidy from the state and federal government. So some of these obvious, these are not subtle things, some obvious things are being done that if we could name them just symbolically, it would be an advance forward. And then people can inhabit that space, having it written large and simply for them.
Thank you. Just to throw a few more in there, and I'm going to take very last comments in a second. There was an original session, I think, from what's been really interesting across all of the shows is where the conversations are at. And some of the conversations, particularly the climate one, was very fast-paced and quick. It was sort of like, you know, we know the story, we know what to do. Whereas the economics one was very different. It was at a different level. It was more around discovering, well, what is this conversation? Does that make sense? And if you think of all the different themes, they're kind of like the petals of a whole, and they're looking at the whole thing, but they're just looking at it from a different view and a different angle. The economics seems to be centred in the middle of it. It's what we're grappling with at the moment. Also, First Nations, white privilege, racism, those conversations are also central to this. Another element that seems to be central is it localization? Is it common in? Is it it's definitely living within our ecological boundaries and identifying our social boundaries. So drawing on the donut economics thing. But I think what we're talking about, and I think touching on what you said then, Terry, is around, I don't really like the word visioning, but it's like naming and imagining it in this place. What is this thing that we're doing that we're all working together towards? I think there are pieces of work around that. And something that I've really noticed is that we need to build our institutional foundations that help us continue to have this conversation. We had the Local Lives Global Matters Conference or Convergence 4 or 5 years ago. A group of us got together to try and do that again, to hold it biannually, create this ritual, this rhythm biannually where we have this conversation deep in our community. And Localising Leanganuk is a group of people that are continuing that conversation over time. So these are kind of like the foundations that hold us together and help us have this conversation where the action spins out of, and also returns back to us and nourishes us for the next conversation. And something that has been bubbling up is the idea of having some sort of school, some sort of place where the conversations can continue to have. And maybe it is, some people have had some crazy ideas about getting some baby boomers to sponsor some young climate activists to maybe enter into this school and learn how to develop some thinking and ideas around how to be living in this place. That was a bit of a ramble, but there's lots of conversations around that. Trying to bring things to a bit of a conclusion. I'm going to cut to Kath at the end. But before I do that, the Castlemaine Commons Collective, we came together, ran 10 shows, had a great time, had fun, curated a number of different conversations. We'd really like to put to you, what should we do next? What of all these ideas should we lean into or not lean into? So I'm not necessarily going to open that conversation up now because we're on time. Feel free to give us that feedback. Any quick final statements and words, maybe answering that question or comments from people? I'm just going to go around really quickly, and remember, 1 or 2 words or a sentence, not 2 sentences. Who would like to go first? And I'll end on you, Kath. Warwick.
Pay the rent.
Pay the rent. Thank you, Warwick. Next person.
Let's take over the festival. What a perfect platform to have deep, rich, multi-layered conversations across art forms and in all kinds of different ways.
Good on you, Alex. Next person. Go for it.
Very much, and keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Terry. Keppel.
Yeah, developing the idea of regenerative economics and what that looks like.
Great, thank you. Lucy Mays.
This might not be as pacey or as fast-tracked as some would like, but meditate, listen deeply to each other and ourselves and the earth.
Thank you. Anitra.
Occupy.
Camillo.
more the self work, so we can do the work externally as well. The importance of that, what Lucy said before.
Emma
Following on
King.
that, decolonize ourselves.
Thanks. Declan.
Yeah, I want to quote Naika Gori on something she said. I read in an article the other day, but basically she says, people who only do the outer work are useless. People who only do the inner work are useless. You got to do the outer work and the inner work at the same time.
Thank you very much. Cam Walker, how's your inner work?
It's working. I think lots of people have noted that, you know, this is a bit tribal and we have this shared set of values and language, and it's about silos. But I think this process has been really exciting because it's been about the different silos in town talking. And I think that it's not unprecedented, but it's very, very healthy. And the next step, of course, is to continue those conversations, deepen them, and include people that aren't in the room with us now.
Tim, Adam?
I think it's about deep listening and sitting with ambiguity, and especially from a very privileged perspective. I think those that are more privileged need to do more of that. And
Trevor?
I'm one of those.
Trevor?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. A safe climate for all, and for us and for our grandchildren going into the future.
Thank you. Nieve?
Change for justice.
Right on. Who have I not got to yet? Have I got to you yet, Sam?
No. Let's dance together. Let's sing together. Let's celebrate these tough times that are coming. And if speaking was more important than listening, we'd have been born with 2 tongues and 1 ear.
Thank you. Lucy Young?
An oldie, but one that I live by is Lil Watson quote, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." To me, it speaks very much about connection.
Thank you, Lucy. Matt Abud? Matthew?
I feel like saying all of the above, but maybe one other to add to the mix is like cross-fertilize, not just between silos, but connection to place where we are, connections that others have in their place, have that kind of cross-fertilization as part of what we're looking to build. Networks to defeat a network. I think that was a quote from one of the shows.
Jan?
Creativity and work.
Thank you. Ilka?
Do what you can with what you have now and don't lose the breath that you've caught in this period.
Thank you. Emma Shannon?
Yeah, I'm going to deep listening resonates with me as well, and just raising the visibility of a diversity of stories.
Thank you, Emma. And Kath, what would you like to say? You get a bit longer.
I had it all in my head very quick because you get bossy with that. Sorry, I'll have to do it quick now. So systematic change needs to occur, and in my heart that I really want to do my bit, and so I have decided to run for council, local council.
Yay, that's really
But
exciting.
remember, that's my bit. There needs to be more.
There needs to be a lot more. A couple of exciting things about the Black Lives Matter rally was, or the declarations, was that there's a commitment to do, to lean into maybe a book group around white privilege, looking at decolonisation and addressing racism. So that's really exciting. Also, another really exciting thing, Kath, which is a commitment to potentially setting up some education working groups with the huge numbers of teachers that committed to take action. That's so exciting, Kath. That'll be so much fun. So that's us done. So I'd really like to say a really, really big thank you for everybody that has contributed and been part of the conversation, and really huge thank yous to people that have been listening and watching on YouTube and commenting and being with us on this journey. I think everybody knows who you are. Just like to say thank you again for everything. And yeah, do please let us know what you think we should do next. Tim, did we want to talk, just really quickly mention about who we think we are as the Commons?
Yeah, I think the Commons is really interesting because we've started to act, and I've lost my notes, so I'll just come back to it. But we've actually started to act before pulling everything together, and I think that's been a really important part of the Commons. And I guess we're going to have a bit of a rest, but I guess we're going to continue to sit around and look and be curious, and look at connecting spaces and look at those kind of connections and see what's happening. And I guess, you know, kind of really seeing and feeling and hearing and what's emerging in our community. Where's the energy? You know, where do we actually see the energy, and where and what will we do to kind of value add to an already vibrant stuff that's happening around the community? So we're interested in those ideas and those collaboration. We're interested in what we can do both internally and externally. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting time for the Commons, and it's great getting together with a whole lot of people that I haven't worked with before. And I think that's the exciting bit too, and welcoming new members and just seeing what the possibility is.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks very much, Tim. And thank you, everybody. Tim, I think we're going to go to that Briggsy clip now. It's on the Slack. And while Tim is trying to get himself together, because I'm a little bit disorganized, feel free to make comments, say thank you. Up to you. Go on, all talk at once.
I was just going to say, when Kath said running for council was her bit, it's not just your bit. You will not be doing it on your own. There's a whole lot of people who will be backing you, because yeah, don't feel like you got to take on that.
No, I didn't mean that. I meant there's more than just me that needs to run for council. That's what I'm meaning. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I meant. I know that. Yeah, I didn't mean that. I meant I'm trying to was encouraging others that need to as also, yeah, to make the change. You certainly, yeah. That's what I was meaning.
She's throwing down the gauntlet, everybody.
Yes.
Tim, is this going to happen? No, it's not. Let's see if I can do it. Oh, no, we're not going to be able to do it.
I'm going to have to finish. I've lost it.
We've lost it. All right, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you later.